The Center for Innovation and Technology is offering you a golden opportunity to speak directly to your market at an affordable price. We also offer media training workshops, live streaming, documentary production, and events management. Get in touch with us today on the following numbers: +263 867 711 0290 or 0718 100 235. Don't forget to subscribe to our social media platforms. Like our Facebook page, Center for Innovation and Technology. Follow us on Twitter @SiteZW. And you can also check out our website, www.site.org.zw.
This was the first time that as part of the policy, observers, in addition to African Union and SADC, other observer groups were also allowed to come in. And we saw observers like the European Union. European Union as an observer group was there as well. Then we have the Commonwealth. Then there was this ZEOM, Zimbabwe International Election Observation Mission, which was formed of IRI and NDI. So those observer missions were also there. Then we had the biggest observer group, the domestic one, which is ZESN, which was on the ground. And then we had other permutations of SADC, like the ECF, SADC ECF, SADC Parliamentary Forum. Then there was COMESA, which was also there as well. Some of the statements that were made by the observer groups. And some of the observer groups, their statements were quite positive. With reference to 2013, there has been a lot of improvements that have taken place in the election process. So the benchmark, if you put 2013 and see the 2018 elections, there had been a number of improvements. But then, as you go around in terms of the details, what these observer groups are saying, how they are qualifying the votes are very critical. Because if you have a report coming after 1 year, who is going to look at the report? You are having a conference now, you would like to see the inputs of the qualifying statement that they are making. By and large, the process was peaceful and well administered. And the one from SADC says the pre-election phase and the voting proceeded in a peaceful and orderly manner and were largely in line with key provisions of legal and constitutional framework and in conformity with the SADC principles and the guidelines on governing democratic elections. So at least the SADC one is more qualifying in the sense that they are referring to their guidelines and standards. African Union also has their guidelines and standards, but they did not relate to that. Then the European Union, as such, many aspects, like they had mentioned a lot of issues, and then the final statement they were saying that many aspects of the 2018 elections in Zimbabwe failed to meet international standards. Again, their reference point is to the international standards on elections. But then, when you read the statements, they're putting a word many aspects. Now, many aspects, again, it's up to the reader to decide. Is many the majority of aspects? If there are 10 key areas, were 8 not met, were 6 not met, were 3 not met? So, again, the statement, it refers to some standards, but it's vague in terms of which aspects that they are talking about, in terms of if you are trying to categorize numerically. But obviously they mention a lot of issues and then they make the statement. Then the Commonwealth again puts a lot of reasons, and then they say for these reasons we are unable to endorse all aspects of the process as credible, inclusive and peaceful. So again their statement says that we are not able to endorse all processes. Maybe some of the processes they are able to endorse. Then the ZEOM one, they say notes several improvements to the electoral process compared to the Zimbabwe's past election, though equally important shortcomings give rise to deep concerns that the process did not make the mark. So now again, it becomes a very generalistic statement that did not meet the mark. What does it mean? But that's where you have a difficulty in terms of gauging the statements that are coming out. Then the ZESN one says the integrity of 2018 harmonized election was undermined by an uneven pre-election playing field. So obviously they are very specific. There was an uneven playing field which undermined the outcome of the elections. So these are just some of the major ones that we have seen, in terms of the areas that I would like to put it here, my colleagues, they mentioned some of the areas, like James was mentioning 6 areas where they put down some of the issues. I would put down in terms of the key areas like 6. One is obviously the overarching one is the legal framework, because there is this question of how legalistic approach the organizations take. Like there was this observation as well that ZEC is taking a very legalistic approach, but eventually things are contested in the court of law. So that is important, that the legal framework has to be very clear. Then the election administration part, which is the entire aspects of work that the election commission is supposed to do to conduct the elections. Then the election environment, the whole discussion around the campaign environment, the aspects of incumbency, the role of traditional leaders, the role of security forces, all that comes in. Then the public outreach and engagement is extremely important. And this includes the engagement of the Electoral Commission, plus the overall voter education and civic education that is taken before the elections by the ZEC, by political parties, by the civil society. Gender and inclusivity is extremely important, because these are the groups that in this issue of bias that I talked about, they remain behind in terms of participation of the election process. And then the media coverage is another critical one. In terms of the legal framework, there are a set of recommendations that are set by all the observers. I've categorized it where all the observers have indicated something and where some of the observers have identified. So these ones are across the board, whether it's AU, SADC, EU, Commonwealth, in one form or the other they are mentioning it. So harmonization of the Electoral Act with the Constitution. It's talked about a lot, but this is one of the key areas that has been indicated. Adoption of political parties law to regulate political parties. This is an important one, and different observer groups have mentioned it differently and emphasized different areas. So some have emphasized the aspect of the political parties' finance, which is very critical, because the whole issue of equity in terms of participation and the availability of resources, how much one party or candidate is spending in terms of the campaign, can only be regulated if you have something around the political parties law, something around the political parties finance regulations, or some legal framework around that. Then consideration to be given to diaspora vote. This is again being said by all. Complaints regarding partisan role played by the traditional leaders, and introduce effective mechanisms to enforce the constitutional provisions prohibiting traditional leaders from partisan activities. So that is also an important thing that is said. Then in terms of some of the observer groups made recommendations, independence of ZEC was mentioned by at least 3-4 observer groups, not all of them, as one of the key areas where they talked about the role of the executive, they talked about the appointment of the commissioners, they talked about some approvals by the ministers. So different things have been mentioned by the observer groups. Then introducing punitive measures, administrative complaints mechanism. These are some of the other important things which they said that there needs to be some punitive measures if there are violations of the code of conduct, violations of the electoral law. Then undertaking new constituency delimitation, considering that in 2018 there was a wide variance between the constituencies with lower registration as far as 14,000 and the highest one being around 70,000, whereas the mean needs to be around 30,000. So you had constituencies which were underrepresented and constituencies which were overrepresented. Then revision and strengthening of election dispute resolution is an important one. Then elimination of provisions of COSA in IPA that are contrary to the Constitution and international covenants. Constitutional amendment to ensure judicial appointments and funding is free from political influence. And also some of them mentioned around the training of judges to be done. Then the next area that we are talking about is election administration. And this mic. On election administration, there is different aspects that have been looked into. So voter registration was one key aspect. And in terms of voter registration, there was the final versions of the voters' roll. Again, this was set by all the observers, including the AU and SAT pointed out that the voters' roll was provided late, the final voters' roll. The preliminary voters' roll was provided before, but the final voters' roll came only a few days before the election, which meant that no audit could be done or no quality assurance measures could be taken. Then there were no clear timelines on the preliminary voters' roll, provisional voters' roll, final voters' roll. These need to be made clear. Then there are anomalies with regard to addresses, and to make sure that the voter roll is more accurate and it enhances the registration in under-registered districts. The under-registered districts issue is not highlighted by all of them, but a few of the observer groups highlighted the issue that provinces like Harare and Bulawayo especially had, Bulawayo had I think around 63–65% of the eligible voters registered. So that is one of the issues that has been indicated in voter registration. Then the next one is on the candidate registration, where there was obviously a lot of mobilization and interest, but then there was poor conduct of the primaries. So you see the issues, the violence, the intra-party violence happening during the primaries, and this whole issue of patronage politics comes in also. It starts at the primary level in terms of participation of the interested candidates. So that's one of the key things that has come out which needs to be addressed. Then candidate nomination fee at times are very high, and obviously deter those people from participation who don't have access to such resources. And the third one, which is the technical one, was that the voters' roll was not provided to the candidates. So the signatures that they needed from the supporters would not be authenticated because they didn't have a voters' roll. And the other one, the second one on the election administration is around the polling day. The voters, I think this is set across all the observer reports that voters being turned away in some polling stations. Now it's varied depending on how many observers were there from the different groups. Like ZESN had the maximum number of observers on the ground. So if you see their report, they identify that in how many instances 1 to 5 people were turned away per polling station, how many instances 5 to 10. So that's, I think, one of the most important area needs to be looked into for the polling day, because otherwise everybody accepts that the polling was done in a very efficient and effective manner, but there were people who were turned away. Either they were not on the voters list for that polling station, or they did not have identity documents. As my colleague was saying, there was a lot of impression among the people that the voter slips could be used as an identity document, and then they were a failure to find the name of the voters roll, or where there were multiple polling stations in the same location, they might have been in another polling station. So this is some of the issues that have been highlighted. Poor lighting, especially at the time of counting, was observed. So what needs to be done in terms of the recommendations coming out from the observer is, observers are increasing and standardizing the length of the training for the polling staff. Then addressing issues of fatigue, because a polling staff, they start at 6 o'clock in the morning with the whole issues around the setup of the polling station. They open at 7 until 7 in the night, and it takes them on average of about 5 hours for conducting the count, and which takes them at least into the night, and then they have to take the results. So this aspect, why it is important, is because it increases the probability of mistakes. If a person is tired, they will make more mistakes. So it is important to address this issue. Then the posting of the voters roll outside the polling station. So if people, even before they queue up, they can look at the voters roll, find their name, and make sure that they are at the right place. And addressing high degree of assisted voting. So assisted voting has remained in Zimbabwe, I think, from the past elections as well, a major issue. Then on results management, again, across all the observers, they say that this process needs to be streamlined for the tallying, tabulation, and transmission of results. The observer reports, it's important to understand that they did not identify issues in terms of the counting process or the tabulation process as such in terms of transparency issues, but what they identified is to streamline the processes so that it becomes more efficient and effective, and the mistakes that are there can be addressed at the different levels. Then ballot paper. We all know about the issues around the transparency issues on the printing of ballot papers and the postal ballots, because the procedure was not clear to anyone, how they were doing actually the way a special vote was done. This is how the police was doing the process, rather than the process of using it as a process which is has the secrecy of vote. So the secrecy of vote in postal ballot was compromised. Then the other area that I think my colleagues have dealt on depth on these one, so I won't go into the details, just I will highlight some of the key points. Like on the election environment, there are challenges in the area of level playing field, and level playing field does, it has to do with the use of incumbency, the use of state resources, all these schemes, the food aid scheme that you talk about, how those resources are channeled and how the voters are influenced. So the recommendations are to create enforcement mechanism, ensuring that government resources don't serve partisan needs. So that's an important recommendation that is coming out. Then on the code of conduct, that the observers, commented on it, that there was a code of conduct that was finalized before the elections. There was a peace pledge that was done, but then the implementation of the code of conduct is where there are challenges, because again there are no enforcement mechanisms. And the MPLCs, the multi-party liaison committees, which are an important conduit for implementing the code of conduct provisions, was not very effective, especially at the level of the national level. Provincial ones, Obviously, they didn't have that much of politics into it, so they did play their role, but the national one was very effective. Intimidation and violence. I think different words have been used. My colleague was using another word for at the level of the intimidation, but the observer reports which I picked up, they've used two words. They've used soft intimidation and smart intimidation. So now this aspect becomes much more difficult to gauge, that if you have this type of intimidation happening, how do you address it based on the legal framework? How do you address it based on the enforcement measures? This is something which has been identified, and the AU and SADC, they refer to the inputs coming from the opposition party. They did not themselves indicate that they saw intimidation, but they indicated that. So, and then the security forces, I think, has been discussed around in terms of the role of the security forces. But in terms of the observer missions, what they talked about more is in terms of the post-election violence. That's the major one that comes out in terms of the role of the security forces. Then we have the issues around public relations. Everybody know in terms of the poor preparations from the ZEC side and how they interacted in terms of communicating. So there's a list of recommendations. You can get this presentation as well, and I have a more detailed analysis that you can go in your free time. But it's just putting across some of the things that ZEC needs to do in terms of reaching out and improving its public relations. So the top of it is actually, having a strategy for communication and the improvement in the NPLCs. So my time is running out very quickly, so I will just skip a few things and gender and inclusion is an important one, where obviously the discussion even in this conference needs to happen in terms of what are you looking in terms of the quota system for the women moving forward. Then the whole issue around the toxic and misogynistic political environment against women. Women as candidates, women as voters, women as head of even the Electoral Commission. So, and the whole issue around the social media, how it was pervasive against in terms of attacks on women. And then with regard to the people with disabilities, the adherence to the international provisions is important, which Zimbabwe needs to be signatory to. Zimbabwe is not currently signatory to those provisions. Then the media coverage, I think again there was an in-depth discussion on the media coverage in terms of the acute polarization. That again has been recognized, and media is an area where all the observer reports have identified the issues with the ZBC, with regards to the polarization, with regard to the media bias, and then they have made recommendations how it needs to be improved in terms of transformation of the broadcasting authority, the issues of media monitoring, which ZEC is supposed to do as per the law, need to be made more effective, than issues about social media. But I think social media needs much more deeper discussion as we move forward, because the social media has changed the dynamics of how the communication spectrum is. It's on the positive side, it has allowed the citizens to engage in a two-way communication. But then obviously on the negative side, it has influenced the discussions in negative ways, and often it has led to this disinformation campaigns as well. But the social media is there to stay and expand. So I think that realization has to be there. Then some last thoughts, I think, which will be important for you in the discussions, that how do you deal with different political interests among the observer groups? EU comes from the, they have a mandate from the EU member states. SADC has it from the SADC organ. AU has it from the AU organ. Then there are others who are getting funding from some other entity. So how do you balance that? how do you interpret the statements being made by the different groups? Because then it is left, the final qualifying statement is again left to the interpretation of who is reading it. That's why in the newspapers you could see one newspaper picking up something from there which was positive and other newspaper picking something which was negative. And you would see two different dimensions. And then how do you delineate the perceptions, opinions, allegations from what are the reality on the ground, what are the facts of the matter. And then what next also we have to see in terms of the government established a task force, but it is not inclusive. So what are the other options? Is there an option of a parliamentary committee, a committee with representation from major political parties, a multi-stakeholder committee, something which takes forward these recommendations from the observer groups? Because the government established the committee, which is an executive one, to look into the recommendations. But it needs to be an inclusive process. It can't be just led by the